A Persian prince rejected a Roman general insulted by his own army. A peace treaty that could have changed the course of empires shattered at the last moment. But what really happened in the shadows of diplomacy and the battlefield? Why did the mighty Roman Empire risk everything on the eve of Easter? Why did Chosroes, the future king of Persia, vow vengeance against Rome? And how did a lone commander named Belisarius stand between chaos and collapse when even his own soldiers turned against him? This is not just the story of a battle. This is the untold drama of betrayal, ambition, broken alliances, and a dangerous game of empires. Let's decode this forgotten chapter of history. It's one that began with letters of peace and ended in the fire of war. Let's start the video. How it was brought about that Procopius wrote his work entitled The Secret History, or The Deeds of Belisarius. Let me tell the story. Listen to me. Now, Procopius of Caesarea was a man of letters and one of the secretaries of the famous general Belisarius. He had written 2 books on the buildings of the Emperor Justinian and others on the wars of that monarch. These contained nothing disgraceful or shameful, but in addition to these works, he wrote a 3rd book of a secret history in which he related many shameful things concerning the emperor and his wife, Theodora, and men of the highest rank. Of this history of his, which he called the Secret History, only one manuscript exists in the British Museum. This contains 16 books. One of these is a preface. In the preface, Procopius says that he wrote his work because he feared that through the lapse of time, the remembrance of these events would be lost. He writes further that he believed his history to be very necessary and profitable for our contemporaries and for posterity, stating that men who wish to engage in war or any kind of contest should learn from the narratives of former contests what has happened in similar circumstances, how it ended, how it was managed, what stratagems were employed, wherein lay its beginning, its middle, and its end, and what it accomplished. Thus, he says, he wrote his history, not concealing anything that befell any person, whether good or evil, and professing to have made every statement true. In the preface, he states that he was an eyewitness of all that happened, and that he considered it fitting to write this history for the instruction of those who may read it. But why, pray tell, was this book not published during the lifetime of the Emperor Justinian? Procopius explains this, saying that he wrote this history as he did for no other reason than that he wished it to be read by his descendants and those who might wish to look into the affairs of his time. However, he goes on to say, he knew that the work would not be published until after the death of Justinian. Why? Because he knew that if he gave his manuscripts to any person, the diligent and deciduous eunuch, Theodore, would watch and spy, would take away the sheets from those who read them and burn them. And besides, he adds, Justinian was growing old, and no man can tell how soon he might depart this life. Therefore, he decided to hide his manuscripts in the ground, and he buried them in a certain garden belonging to his country house, where he used to pass the summer season. Then, after making this decision, he went to the emperor and said that he had composed a poem about his campaigns, but that it was too long and tedious and unfit to be shown to him. For, he says, my style, which is suited to poems of small size, was now utterly unsuited to the magnitude of your campaigns, which I attempted to celebrate in a proper manner. That is true, K. He says, I am sending to you a part of this poem, but only that part which deals with your wars in Africa, because it is small and of slight bulk. You care to read it. He continues, send for me, and I shall read the rest to you. You can have the whole poem if you like, but if it appears tedious to you, know that I have not ventured to compose any more poems in praise of your campaigns. And with these words, he excused himself from reading the other books he had written. Now, this excuse seemed very plausible to the emperor, and Procopius gained favor thereby. Nevertheless, as time went on, Justinian grew old and departed this life. Then Procopius, took the books of his history out of the ground and published them. Some critics hold that Procopius wrote this book as a satire against the emperor and his wife. However, in the preface, Procopius declares that he wrote nothing disgraceful to the emperor or his wife, and that, in this history of his, which he calls the secret history, he wrote nothing unworthy of the majesty of the imperial throne, nothing unbecoming the empress, nor anything of an immoral character. Let us see whether he kept to his word, or whether there are disgraceful and shameful things in this history of his. This is the first book of the secret history. We shall read the first chapter, in which Procopius relates how the emperor sent Belisarius to wage war against the Goths and the Franks. When the empire had recovered from the perils caused by the Persians, the Gothic war was raging far away in the regions of the Spaniards. The emperor was anxious to bring Spain back under the rule of Rome. For this purpose, he summoned the most valiant of his generals, Belisarius. At that time, Belisarius was in Africa and received the following orders from the emperor. The emperor wrote to him that he was aware that many of the Frankish and Gothic chiefs had revolted and left the empire. He desired Belisarius to march against them, to restore those who had revolted to obedience, and to subdue those who had not yet revolted. He ordered him to begin the campaign in Provence, for that city was held by the Goths. He also gave him 7,000 infantry, 700 cavalry, and 40 elephants. Procopius writes that the emperor chose Belisarius for this war because he was well versed in military affairs and because he had perfect confidence in his ability and bravery. Moreover, the emperor hoped that the war would be brief and that Belisarius would return to complete the subjugation of Africa. And now, Belisarius, having received these commands, prepared for the expedition and sailed from the harbor of Carthage with his fleet, with cavalry and infantry and all kinds of supplies. When he arrived in Provence, the Gothic king Alaric fled to the mountains, and Belisarius pursued him. Procopius tells how the Romans attacked the Goths and the Franks in Narni, defeated them, and captured the king's baggage. On hearing this, Alaric rushed into battle with all his strength, and Procopius tells how the Romans defeated the Goths, took their king's tent, and plundered all his camp. Then he goes on to tell how Belisarius proceeded to ravage the land of the Franks, how the Franks fled before him, and how he continued his campaign as far as Toulouse. Arriving here, he learned that his fleet had been wrecked in a storm, and that all his supplies had been lost. Nevertheless, he continued his campaign, ravaged the lands of the Franks, and forced them to flee. During all this time, the Gothic king, Alaric, was afraid to appear in public. Then Belisarius besieged him in a fortress, laid siege to it, took it by assault, slew the Gothic king, and brought the province of Septimania under the rule of Rome. After this, he marched into Aquitaine, ravaged the land, and returned to his camp near Narni. Here, he received instructions from the emperor to attack the Visigoths in Spain. After accomplishing this, he was to return to Africa. Thus, we come to the end of the first chapter of the first book of Procopius' secret history, and we see that he has related nothing disgraceful or shameful concerning the emperor or any of the nobles. And we shall find out presently whether there are any such things in the remaining chapters of this history. After the death of Emperor Justinian, his empress, Theodora, was regarded as the chief of the empire, although she did not openly display her authority. Many believed that the reason for this was that she was a woman of low birth. Others assert that the reason was the emperor's fear of losing his power. Some people say that she hated the nobility and therefore kept herself hidden in order to avoid their hatred. But the real reason was that she was unable to control the empire because she had no understanding of affairs of state, and because she was a woman. It is evident that Procopius wrote this history many years after the death of Justinian. However, in this preface, he does not mention the year in which he began or completed his work. He only says that it was written in the city of Caesarea, in the region of Palestina, and that it was finished there. He also says that he wrote this history for the instruction of posterity, and that he made no concealment of anything that happened in the wars of Justinian, whether good or evil. He further says that he was an eyewitness of all these events, and that the work was written in the Greek language. Finally, he asks his readers to judge his history by its contents, since he has not composed it with rhetorical cleverness, but has written the truth. Let us now see whether Procopius has kept his word and has not written anything disgraceful or shameful concerning the emperor or his wife, or whether he has written such things in this history of his. This is the second book of the secret history. We shall read the first chapter. In this chapter, Procopius tells how Emperor Justinian sent Belisarius to wage war against the Goths. The emperor had sent Belisarius to Provence with orders to defeat the Goths and the Franks and to reduce the province of Septimania to obedience. And now Belisarius was besieging a fortress of the Goths, when suddenly a herald came to him from the Gothic king, Amalaric, bearing a letter in which the king invited Belisarius to meet him in a certain place in the midst of the river Ebro, so that they might confer together. Accordingly, Belisarius crossed the river with 20 cavalry and met the Gothic king. After they had talked together for a long time, Belisarius returned to his camp. After a few days, a herald again came to him from the Gothic king, Alaric, inviting him to meet him in the same place. And when Belisarius came, Alaric told him that he wished to surrender the fortress in all Gothic Spain to him, and in return, he asked that he, Alaric, his followers, should be allowed to settle in a province of the empire, where they should enjoy their possessions and live subject to the emperor. Belisarius answered that he had no authority to grant this request, and that he must receive instructions from the emperor. Now we must return to the Emperor Theodosius. When he had grown to manhood and was in the prime of life, and Istigirds had been taken from the world by disease, Perozes, the Persian king, invaded the Roman domains with a mighty army. But he accomplished no damage and returned to his home without accomplishing anything. This came about in the following way. Anatolius, general of the East, had, as it happened, been sent by the Emperor Theodosius as ambassador to the Persians. He was to go to the court of the Persian king and discuss the matter of the border disputes. Now, Anatolius approached the Median army with only a small force, for he had left the rest of his troops at some distance from the camp. And as he drew near the camp, he saw that he would have to meet the king himself. So he halted his advance and sent messengers before him to inquire how he should greet the king. They told him that he should leap down from his horse and advance on foot toward the royal presence. Accordingly, when Anatolius drew near, he left his mount standing where it was and advanced on foot toward Veraranes. And when the Persian monarch saw this man who was coming forward, he inquired from those who were near who this man could be, who was coming forward alone, unattended by any troops. And they replied that it was the general of the Romans. Thereupon, the king was so dumbfounded by this excessive degree of respect that he himself wheeled his horse about and rode away, and the whole Persian host followed him. So Anatolius entered the king's presence, riding on horseback, and sat down upon a nearby chair. Whereupon Veraranes also sat down again. Then he sent for wine, and after drinking and making merry together, they talked about the business that had brought Anatolius to the Persian court. And when the ambassadors said that he had nothing more to discuss with the king, since he was empowered to make only one treaty, and that one of minor import, Veraranes made answer that he would give him that treaty. Indeed, he said, you shall have your wish. But when he had given his word, he added, I think it fitting that you should also receive a pledge of our amity. And he sent for his daughter, who was at that time in her father's camp, and presented her to Anatolius, that she might be a pledge of the peace between the two nations. When the ambassadors were ready to depart, he gave them much gold and silver and precious garments and fine carpets. Then he dismissed them. They crossed over into Roman territory, and both kings kept their word. We should not believe, therefore, Some persons asserted that the Persians were untruthful and liars, for this is far from being true. If any people ever deserved the title of liars, it is the Romans, who frequently changed their mind. And it is a saying among the Persians, if a Roman makes a statement once, he will retract it twice. That is to say, the Romans are such that if they speak truly once, they will lie twice. But let us now return to Anatolius. Tortius, after he had passed over the river with all his forces and had pitched his camp, he opened negotiations with the Persians concerning the boundary line, but Veranes treated him shamefully and spoke insolently. Whereupon Anatolius rose up and said that if he would not listen to reason, he would burn his camp to the ground. And he really raised a fire and burned his camp to the ground. However, Veranes was not troubled by this, for he had come fully prepared for war and thought that he would defeat the Romans. When the Roman emperor heard of this, he sent a large force under the command of the generals Stilicho and Latadrus to aid Anatolius. Meanwhile, Veranes was preparing for invasion of Roman territory. It seemed likely that if the Roman generals were to join Anatolius, there would be a battle, and many heralds and ambassadors passed back and forth between the two armies. But Veranes was insolent and would not agree to a compromise. In addition, he tried to bribe the generals Stilicho and Latagores with large sums of money, promising that if they would turn against Anatolius, he would share the plunder with them. But the generals gave him a negative answer. Then he went on with his preparations for invading Roman territory. However, while he was dispatching his business, a certain slave named Mercurius, who had accompanied the Roman generals as interpreter, escaped to the Roman camp and told them that King Veranes was bribing Stilicho and Latagres with large sums of money, hoping that they would desert Anatolius. Accordingly, the generals assembled their troops and marched out to meet those of Anatolius. And when they joined him, his tent was filled with spoils which he had taken from the Persians. The generals were overjoyed and shouted aloud. And on that day, the whole Roman army joined battle with the Persians and totally defeated them. A great multitude of Persians perished in the fight. Veranes himself fled into a cave and lay hidden there for 7 days until some peasants found him and led him out. Then they bound him and dragged him along in disgrace. Finally, he was delivered into the hands of the Romans, and they racked his body with whips, after which they cut off his head and threw it into the river. Thus, the invincible and powerful Roman arms subdued the Persians. After these events, the entire empire enjoyed a season of profound tranquility. Meanwhile, the Huns beyond the Danube grew bolder and transgressed the confines of their own territory. The emperor sent deputies to them with gifts, enjoining them to stay within their own borders and promising them increased gifts if they would do so. But the barbarians were insatiable and did not heed what the deputies said. Upon this, the emperor determined to make war on them, and he called together the most valiant warriors throughout the entire province. At the same time, he sent messengers to the consuls and masters of the cavalry throughout Italy, commanding them to bring every able-bodied man who was capable of bearing arms. On receiving these orders, the whole population abandoned their homes, leaving their wives and children behind, and came to join the emperor. And when the barbarians heard that the Romans were coming against them, they also abandoned their villages and took to flight. But the Roman troops pursued them and slew a great multitude. Many of them fell into a deep bog, and those who were able to climb out of it were slain by the Romans. Thus, the Romans fought bravely and won a glorious victory over the barbarians. The rest fled and dared not stand against the Romans anymore. It was during the reign of this emperor that the first inroads were made into Africa by the Vandals, and that a terrible pestilence broke out, and a third part of the human race perished from the face of the earth. Now, as the empire was enjoying a season of profound tranquility, thanks to the valor of its invincible soldiers, the emperor decided to erect a palace at Constantinople. He brought in the choicest marble from the quarries of Greece and adorned the palace with precious adornments. He himself moved into this palace, and it still stands today. It is now called the Palace of the Porphyrogenitos. It has often been embellished by succeeding emperors and is the seat of the imperial power in the Eastern Roman Empire. At that time, the emperor made war on the Sarmatians, and after defeating them, he returned to the city. When he had restored everything to its former peace and prosperity, he summoned the most learned men in the cities of the provinces and commanded them to write down the histories of their own times, that the accounts of all the emperors from the beginning of Rome might be recorded in writings. This they accordingly did, and handed over their writings to the keeper of the imperial library, which is still in existence today, containing books written on papyrus, parchment, or in the form of scrolls. Moreover, the emperor collected all the laws that had been enacted by the emperors, one by one, and published them in golden tablets, which were placed in the temple of Jupiter. He, likewise, caused the various departments of the law to be revised by commissioners appointed by himself, and he ordered that the laws that were unjust should be abolished, while those that were useful he confirmed. These were afterwards collected by a commission under the presidency of a praetorian prefect, and were published in bronze columns placed in all the courts of justice throughout the entire empire. In the Forum of Rome, he set up 4 bronze columns on which were inscribed the 12 tables of the ancient Roman law. The emperor waged war on the Goths, and when he had overcome them, he gave them permission to settle in the province of Dacia, on condition that they should pay tribute to the Roman state. Quies, he made war on the Alans, who inhabit Scythia, and on the Quadi and other tribes. After overcoming them, he caused them to be baptized in the Christian faith. He also made war on the bishops, who were a powerful tribe in Germany, and forced them to pay him tribute. And he continued to wage wars of this kind during the whole of his reign. During this emperor's reign, the blessed apostle Athanasius died, who had been ordained bishop of Alexandria by the holy apostle Mark. He had always opposed the Arians and had been exiled 5 times on account of his orthodoxy. The emperor recalled him from exile and allowed him to enter the city triumphantly. Then he summoned all the bishops of the provinces and compelled them to subscribe to the Nicene Creed. Those who refused to do so, he banished from the empire. Afterwards, the emperor issued an edict in which he commanded all men to reverence the Christian faith and forbade anyone to revile its ministers. He also established a public bathhouse at Constantinople, which he named the Adosian, and invited all Christians to bathe there. He granted them exemption from taxes and promised that if they would use the baths, they should not have to endure the insults of the Jews and others. And so, in this manner, the reign of the most pious and invincible Emperor Theodosius lasted for 37 years. When death came to him, he left the empire to his sons Arcadius and Honorius, ordering that they should rule jointly over the entire empire, about 200 miles north of Merv, between the river Oxus and the mountains of the Hindu Kush. There is a valley watered by streams flowing from these mountains, where the air is warm in winter and the grass grows abundantly. It is encircled by high mountain ridges on 3 sides and is open only to the east towards Warezum. Here among these mountains lived the White Huns, a people so called by the Greeks because of the color of their hair and skin. This was in the days when Alexander the Great was invading India, and we are told by some writers that they were identical with the Giantines mentioned by the Chinese. In the 4th century, they lived beyond the Sogdians, to the north of Samarkand and the Fergana Valley, and seem to have been the same people as the Ephthalitae, who later became masters of Central Asia, a few decades before our story opens. A Hunnic leader named Balbera, probably the same as Balim, the hostage, took many of his clansmen south into what is now Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, where they lived among the Indo-Scythians and other Iranian peoples. When the Emperor Kaveh I of Persia began his war with the Huns around 531, it was these southern Huns whom he fought. Soon after the events of our last story, a new king of the White Huns named Atli emerged. We are told that he was an extremely cruel and ambitious ruler who tried to conquer the neighboring kingdoms. Among the Persians living under the rule of the Sasanian Empire were the Sogdians. Though they belonged to the Iranian family of languages, they were closer culturally to the Turks and Mongols than to their Persian overlords. During the reign of Kavad, they revolted against Persian domination. He sent his son, the Crown Prince Khosrau, to crush the rebellion. The young prince married a Sogdian princess to secure the loyalty of her father, a rebel chief named Vishtaspa. The wedding celebrations lasted 70 days, during which time the two became great friends. One day, Khosrau told his father-in-law about a magnificent horse he had seen in the stables of the king of the Huns. Vishtaspa said, "I can get you a horse twice as good." So he went to the market and bought a strong and beautiful horse for his son and presented it to Khosrau. The prince rode the horse home, but by evening he returned to Vishtaspa and said, "I will keep the horse if you tell me how you got it." Then Vishtaspa told him that he had stolen it from the Huns. Khosrau replied, "You can steal a horse from the Huns. You can steal anything. I will give you another horse tomorrow." So at night, Khosrau and his man snuck into the Hunnic camp and stole another horse. The next day, he returned to Fetish and said, "I'll keep the horse if you tell me how you got it." Fetish replied, "I took it from someone who stole it from the king of the Huns. If you want to take something from the Huns, you must strike their king down and plunder his city." So, the following night, Khosrau sneaked into the Huns' tent and killed Altai in his sleep. Taking the queen and princesses captive, he rode back to the capital of the Sasanians with the spoils. And this is how we come to the beginning of our tale. Not long after this, disregarding the oath he had sworn, he was eager to avenge himself upon the Huns for the insult done him. He therefore straightway gathered together from the whole land all the Persians and their allies, and led them against the Ephthalitae. Of all his sons, he left behind him only one Cabes by name, who, as it happened, was just past the age of boyhood. All the others, about 30 in number, he took with him. The Ephthalitae, upon learning of his invasion, were aggrieved at the deception they had suffered at the hands of their enemy, and bitterly reproached their king as having abandoned them to the Medes. He, with a laugh, inquired of them what in the world of theirs he had abandoned to the Medes, and they retorted that he had abandoned nothing except, forsooth, the one opportunity on which, as it turned out, everything else depended. Now the Ephthalitae, with all zeal, demanded that they should go out to meet the invaders. But the king sought to restrain them, at any rate for the moment, for he insisted that as yet they had received no definite information as to the invasion, for the Persians were still within their own boundaries. So, remaining where he was, he busied himself as follows. In the plain where the Persians were to make their eruption into the land of the Ephthalitae, he marked off a tract of very great extent and made a deep trench of sufficient width. But in the center, he left a small portion of ground intact enough to serve as a way for 10 horses. Over the trench, he placed reeds, and upon the reeds, he scattered earth, thereby concealing the true surface. He then directed the forces of the Huns that, when the time came to retire, these should draw themselves together into a narrow column and pass rather slowly across this neck of land, taking care that they should not fall into the ditch. And he hung from the top of the royal banner the salt over which Perozes had once sworn the oath, which he had disregarded in taking the field against the Huns. Now, as long as he heard that the enemy were in their own territory, he remained at rest. But when he learned from his scouts that they had reached the city of Gorgo, which lies on the extreme Persian frontier, and that departing thence they were advancing against his army, remaining himself with the greater part of his troops inside the trench, he sent forward a small detachment with instructions to allow themselves to be seen at a distance by the enemy in the plain, and, when once they had been seen, to flee at full speed to the rear, keeping in mind his command concerning the trench. As soon as they drew near to it, they did as directed, and as they approached the trench, they drew themselves into a narrow column, and all passed over and joined the rest of the army. But the Persians, having no means of perceiving the stratagem, gave chase at full speed across a very level plain. Possessed as they were by a spirit of fury against the enemy, and fell into the trench, every man of them, not alone the first, but also those who followed in the rear. For since they entered into the pursuit with great fury, as I have said, they failed to notice the catastrophe which had befallen their leaders, but fell in on top of them with their horses and lances, so that, as was natural, they both destroyed them, and were themselves no less involved in ruin. Among them were Perozes and all his sons. And just as he was about to fall into this pit, they say that he realized the danger and seized and threw from him the pearl which hung from his right ear, a gem of wonderful whiteness, and greatly prized on account of its extraordinary size. This story, however, seems to me untrustworthy, because a man who found himself in such straits would hardly think of saving a jewel which could have been of no avail to him, nor indeed would it have been possible for him to do so. Moreover, the statement that he threw the pearl away in order that no one might wear it after him is utterly devoid of plausibility. For what purpose would it have been thus preserved? Was he going to enjoy it in the next world? Or why did he not destroy it if he wished it not to fall into the hands of others? I am inclined to believe, therefore, this is a fable devised by the Persians to hide their own fault and shift the blame upon the king of the Huns. It is, indeed, reasonable that they should have taken this precaution to cover up their own failure, seeing that they had previously boasted so loudly of their certainty of success. For it was universally proclaimed that they would capture the queen and princesses alive and bring them before the king. But not only did they fail to accomplish this, but they did not even know that they had fallen into the trap laid for them until they had met their death. As soon as all the Persians were dead, the Huns came out from the trench and captured the queen and princesses, bringing them before King Vitispah. He received them with every demonstration of honor and bestowed on them gifts of gold and jewels. He then summoned the nobles of the White Huns and spoke to them as follows: "The Persians have done us a great service by slaying our enemies and freeing us from the burden of avenging ourselves. Let us requite their generosity by giving them a hearty welcome and treating them as honored guests." Upon hearing this, all the Huns shouted with a single voice, "Well spoken, O king." And they did everything they could to entertain the Persians and make them feel at home. Its queen and princesses, too, though they had been captives, behaved like queens and princesses. So the Persians stayed with the Huns for 7 days, feasting and making merry together. On the 8th day, however, they prepared to depart. The princesses, when they took their leave of the king, asked for permission to take a few things with them. With this permission, they loaded up elephants with the gold and silver ornaments they had been wearing, and likewise filled their own pack animals with all the finery they had been given. The queen, moreover, took with her 100 maidens and 100 eunuchs, besides officers and attendants. The king saw that she was loading more than the prescribed number of elephants. He therefore asked her if she wanted to take more. She replied, "By your majesty's permission, I will take as much as I can carry away." So the king ordered that she should take whatever she desired. In this way, the Persians departed from the kingdom of the Huns and returned to Persia, taking with them the queen and princesses. Upon reaching the capital, the king gave them each separate palaces, and the queen he treated like his own mother. From that time forth, the friendship between the Persians and the Huns continued to flourish, and they fought many battles side by side. In the end, the White Huns were driven out of Central Asia by the Turks, but they survived as a people until the Arab conquest. The keeper of the prison bade her give herself over to the man to treat as he wished. In this way, the keeper of the prison came to be familiar with the woman, and he conceived for her an extraordinary love, and as a result permitted her to go in to her husband, just as she wished, and to depart from there, again without interference from anyone. Now there was a Persian notable, Perozes by name, a devoted friend of Arcadius. who was constantly in the neighborhood of this prison, watching his opportunity in the hope that he might in some way be able to effect his deliverance. And he sent word to Capades through his wife that he was keeping horses and men in readiness not far from the prison. And he indicated to him a certain spot. Then one day, as night drew near, Capades persuaded his wife to give him her own garment, and, dressing herself in his clothes, to sit instead of him in the prison where he usually sat. In this way, therefore, Capades made his escape from the prison. For, although the guards who were on duty saw him, they supposed that it was the woman, and therefore decided not to hinder or otherwise annoy him. At daybreak, they saw in the cell the woman in her husband's clothes, and were so completely deceived as to think that Capades was there. And this belief prevailed during several days until Capades had advanced well on his way. Now, as to the fate which befell the woman after the stratagem had come to light, in the manner in which they punished her, I am unable to speak with accuracy, for the Persian accounts do not agree with each other, and for this reason I omit the narration of them. Capades, in company with Perozes, completely escaped detection and reached the Ephthalitae Huns. There the king gave him his daughter in marriage, and then, since Capades was now his son-in-law, he put under his command a very formidable army for a campaign against the Persians. This army the Persians were quite unwilling to encounter, and they made haste to flee in every direction. And when Capades reached the territory where Gusan States exercised his authority, he stated to some of his friends that he would appoint as Chanaranges the first man of the Persians who should, on that day, come into his presence and offer his services. But even as he said this, he repented his speech, for there came to his mind a law of the Persians, which ordains that offices among the Persians shall not be conferred upon others than those to whom each particular honor belongs by right of birth. For he feared lest someone should come to him first, who was not a kinsman of the present Chanaranges, and that he would be compelled to set aside the law in order to keep his word. Even as he was considering this matter, chance brought it about that, without dishonoring the law, he could still keep his word. For the first man who came to him happened to be a Durga Downbades, a young man who was a relative of Gusanastades and an especially capable warrior. He addressed Capades as Lord, and was the first to do obeisance to him as king, but praising him to use him as a slave for any service whatever. Thus it came about that by good fortune, without violation of law or breaking of promise, Capades was served by a most valiant warrior. And the latter, receiving abundant proofs of his master's favor, showed himself exceedingly serviceable, both because he was naturally endowed with ability, and also because he was eager to make himself conspicuous by honorable deeds. When, therefore, the Persians perceived that their affairs were going badly, they determined to send to the Turanians for succor, and dispatched a messenger accordingly. But Perozes got wind of this, and, riding up to Gusanast, said to him, "What thou art doing, that I also can do, and better than that. I can accomplish what is yet unachieved." Upon this, Gusanast was greatly astonished, and said to him, "What is that?" To whom he replied, "I know full well that thou hast sent for assistance to the Turanians, and I myself have dispatched a messenger ahead of thee to invite the Turanian king to come and help thee. I will show thee what I have done." Thereupon he rode forth in advance of the rest, and halted not far from the road, at a distance where he was seen by the Persian messenger. The latter, supposing that he was an officer of great rank, went up to him and said, "If thou wilt show me the way, I will conduct the Turanians to where thou art, and thus they will easily be able to overtake thee." Herewith, Perozes rejoined, "Lead the way, then, and let us betake ourselves to the camp." Accordingly, when the Persian messenger had conducted him to the very spot where the Turanians were encamped, he did not enter the camp, but sat down nearby, as though awaiting something. And when the Turanians arrived, he rose from his seat, and, presenting himself before them, said, "Where is your general?" Come forward and show yourself to me." The Turan messenger, hearing these words, knew perfectly well what was meant, and answered, "This is my lord, the general," saying which, he led the way into the camp. So Perozes went in and conversed privately with the Turan king, and thereafter, having taken counsel together, they came out again and mounted their horses. Then Perozes said to the king, "Leave thy camp here and follow me." And they departed. It was Perozes' plan to get rid of the Turanians altogether. And for this purpose, when they had ridden a long distance, he pointed to a certain high mountain peak and said, "Here we must needs turn our faces about and go back." The reason for this is that if the Turanians should come upon the Persians without any interval of time between them, the Persians would be entirely routed and exterminated. But if there should be an interval, then the Persians would be deprived of courage, and would consider themselves abandoned by fortune, and so they would not strive so vigorously in battle. So he brought the Turanians back to where they had been previously encamped. Afterward, when the Persians came up and saw that the Turan army was already there, they thought that the Turan king had come to their rescue. And Ephthalitae, greatly rejoicing, rode out to meet him, thinking that all would now be well. When they met, however, the Turan king said to him, "Why dost thou persist in opposing me so stubbornly? Surrender thyself and live." But Ephthalitae angrily retorted, "Thou liest like the serpent. If thou thinkest thou canst frighten me with such words, thou art sorely mistaken. Never shall I surrender myself to thee, nor shall any of my followers submit to servitude." The Turan king replied, "So be it then. I see plainly enough that thou art headstrong and unreconcilable. Therefore, prepare thyself to die." And they fell to fighting. The Persians fought bravely, but were gradually beaten back toward their own camp. And when Ephthalitae was hard pressed, he made his way into a tent and closed the entrance behind him. However, the Turan army spread their couches over the opening, and Perozes himself entered and said to him, "Thou art trapped like a rat in a net, and there is no escape. Give thyself up, therefore, and live." Then Ephthalitae surrendered himself into his hands. Hereupon, Perozes released him from his bonds, and, stripping off his garments, gave them to the soldiers to be divided among them. But when he himself was led before the Turan king, he received honorable treatment, and they made him lord of the country which he had just lost. This country he possessed for 7 years, paying tribute to the Turan king. In the 8th year, however, an insurrection broke out in his province, and he himself fell fighting against his own people. And thus ends the history of the kings of Persia from the first to the last. And now I must bring to a close this record of their deeds. Since I have related everything which has come down to us concerning them, I say unto you also, take heed how you behave yourselves in time to come, and shown the errors of those who have gone before you. Let every deed of thine be according to wisdom, and let your life on earth be blameless. For there is nothing more precious than a good report among men. This being so, depart then now in peace. I have previously told how the Huns overran the provinces of the east, and how the Romans got possession of Atropatene, and how the Caucasian Albanians made an invasion into Atropatene. After all these events, the king of the Ephthalitae, namely Ephthalitae, was owing the king of the Ephthalitae a sum of money which he was not able to pay him, and he therefore requested the Roman Emperor Anastasius to lend him this money. Whereupon Anastasius conferred with some of his friends and inquired of them whether this should be done. And they would not permit him to make the loan, for, as they pointed out, it was inexpedient to make more secure by means of their money the friendship between their enemies and the Ephthalitae. Indeed, it was better for the Romans to disturb their relations as much as possible. It was for this reason, and for no just cause, that Arcadius decided to make an expedition against the Romans. 502 AD, first he invaded the land of the Armenians, moving with such rapidity as to anticipate the news of his coming, and after plundering the greater part of it in a rapid campaign, he unexpectedly arrived at the city of Amida, which is situated in Mesopotamia. And although the season was winter, he invested the town. Now, the men of Amida had no soldiers at hand, seeing that it was a time of peace and prosperity, and in other respects were utterly unprepared. Nevertheless, they were quite unwilling to yield to the enemy and showed an unexpected fortitude in holding out against dangers and hardships. Now, there was among the Syrians a certain just man, Jacobus by name, who had trained himself with exactitude in matters pertaining to religion. This man had confined himself many years before in a place called Indialan, a day's journey from Amida, in order that he might, with more security, devote himself to pious contemplation. The men of this place, assisting his purpose, had surrounded him with a kind of fencing, in which the stakes were not continuous, but set at intervals, so that those who approached could see and converse with him. And they had constructed for him a small roof over his head, sufficient to keep off the rain and snow. There, this man had been sitting for a long time, never yielding either to heat or cold, and sustaining his life with certain seeds, which he was accustomed to eat, not indeed every day, but only at long intervals. Now, some of the Ephthalaites who were overrunning the country thereabouts saw this Jacobus, and with great eagerness drew their bows with intent to shoot at him. But the hands of every one of them became motionless and utterly unable to manage the bow. When this was noised about through the army and came to the ears of Cebades, he desired to see the thing with his own eyes. And when he saw it, both he and the Persians who were with him were seized with great astonishment, and he entreated Jacobus to forgive the barbarians their crime. And he forgave them with a word, and the men were released from their distress. Capes then bade the man ask for whatever he wished, supposing that he would ask for a great sum of money. And he also added with youthful recklessness that he would be refused nothing by him. But he requested Cebades to grant to him all the men who during that war should come to him as fugitives. This request Cebades granted, and gave him a written pledge of his personal safety. And great numbers of men, as might be expected, came flocking to him from all sides and found safety there, for the deed became widely known. Thus, then, did these things take place. And now let us relate how John, who was a Persian by race, but had been brought up in the Roman province of Asia, and was at that time in his own country, managed to get together a band of soldiers and make himself master of the city of Dara, where he set up his royal residence. In the first book of this work, I have already related how Belisarius, general of the Exarch, who had been sent from Constantinople to repel the incursions of the Persians, had been obliged to retreat into Lazica and had fortified himself in the city of Petra. From here, he sent envoys to the king of the Turks to negotiate a truce. But the ambassador was murdered by the Turks. Therefore, when the Roman emperor heard of this, he sent another embassy to the Turks, giving orders that if the envoys were again killed, war should be declared. And while the ambassadors were on their way to the Turks, the Persian king Kavad died, and his son, who was called Chosroes, succeeded to the kingdom. The new emperor was well disposed towards the Romans, so that when the Roman ambassadors arrived, he restored the envoy whom the Turks had slain and concluded a truce. Now, when Belisarius heard this, he thought that he ought not to remain in Lazica, seeing that the Persians were at peace with the Romans. So he moved to the city of Tibris, which is in Mesopotamia, and took possession of it. Soon afterwards, he led his troops beyond the Tigris and ravaged the country of the Persians. This incursion was so rapid and unexpected that the Persians were unable to make any defense against him. Then Belisarius returned to Tarsus and spent the winter there. In the following spring, he entered Persia again and advanced as far as the city of Singara. There he pitched his camp, and having fortified it against sieges, he sent out detachments to gather in supplies. These detachments pillaged everything they could lay their hands on and returned to the main camp loaded with spoil. The foraging parties of the Persians who sallied out to intercept the Romans were completely defeated. Meanwhile, the governor of Singara, named Solomon, was preparing to defend the city. However, when the Roman emperor learned this, he wrote a letter to Solomon, commanding him by all means to surrender the city to the Persians. Accordingly, when Solomon received this command, he opened negotiations with Belisarius, by means of which he delivered the city without resistance. When the troops of Belisarius entered it, he ordered that the inhabitants should not be harmed, nor the churches destroyed, nor anything else removed. From Singara, the Roman general went to the city of Risapha. Thence, he dispatched cavalry and infantry detachments to cut off supplies from the Persians. He himself stayed in Risapha. At this point, the exarch received an urgent letter from the emperor, summoning him to Constantinople because the Gothic War had broken out again. In obedience to this summons, Belisarius abandoned his camp and withdrew his troops to the city of Tyana. There he left the winter quarters and set out on his journey. To him, however, it seemed unfair to leave the Mesopotamia district undefended. Therefore, he entrusted the conduct of affairs there to John, a Roman officer, and gave him full power to act as he thought best. He equipped him with suitable forces. So John, taking advantage of the fact that the Persians were expecting the Romans to do nothing, boldly advanced against them and captured the city of Dara, which is situated near the river Tigris, opposite the city of Edessa. Here, he established his court and lived there, as we've said before, royally. It happened about this time that the Huns sent an embassy to the Emperor Anastasius, asking for the restoration of the possessions which the Romans had taken from them. The emperor did not consider this request worthy of reply. But Belisarius, learning what had taken place, wrote back to the Huns that he was ready to return their property to them if they would join him in war against the Persians. The Huns accepted these terms and raised an army of 40,000 men, which they sent to aid the Romans. They marched through the country of the Persians, destroying cities and villages along their route. The Huns did not know the country and therefore suffered great losses from ambushes laid by the Persians. When John learned this, he led his troops to meet the Huns and joined them in battle. Afterwards, he gave them counsel and urged them to wage war in a manner suited to their strength. At that time, the kings of the Ephthalitae and the Alans invaded Roman territory with large armies and devastated the country. The Emperor Anastasius was very upset about this and summoned Belisarius from the Gothic front to come and deal with the barbarians. However, Belisarius was very reluctant to abandon the Gothic War since it was making considerable progress. Moreover, he did not want to go to the east because he knew perfectly well that it was impossible to subdue the Persians. However, when the emperor ordered him repeatedly to go to Mesopotamia and not to return without subduing the barbarians, he started on his journey. During his absence, John continued the war against the Persians with great success. And when Belisarius returned to Mesopotamia, he joined John and fought many battles against the Persians. But the outcome of these battles was uncertain, and the Romans and Persians kept gaining victories by turns. Then Belisarius advised the emperor to send him a large body of troops, saying that if he had enough soldiers, he would conquer Persia without any difficulty. But the emperor did not want to do this, for he feared lest the Romans would become too powerful if victory was vouchsafed to them. Besides this, he was afraid of emptying the treasury. So he replied that if Belisarius could conquer the Persians with the forces he had, he would give him great rewards for it. And so Belisarius, having received this answer, fought against the Persians with the troops that were at his disposal, suffering many hardships and defeats. He, at last, after great toil and infinite bloodshed, forced the Persians to withdraw within their own borders. After accomplishing this, he wanted to lead his troops into Armenia and winter there. But the emperor wrote to him that since the Gothic War had broken out again, he must return as quickly as possible to the front. So Belisarius reluctantly abandoned Armenia and went to the city of Callinicum in Mesopotamia, where he intended to spend the winter. But in the early part of winter, he fell ill and died there. Thus ended the life of one of the greatest generals that ever lived. His body was buried at Berytus, which is now called Beirut. How King Kavats took the city of Amida. Not many days later, one of the Persians saw close by one of the towers the mouth of an old underground passage, which was insecurely concealed with some few small stones. In the night, he came there alone, and, making trial of the entrance, got inside the circuit wall. Then, at daybreak, he reported the whole matter to Kabitz. The king himself on the following night came to the spot with a few men, bringing ladders which he had made ready, and he was favored by a piece of good fortune. For the defense of the very tower, which happened to be nearest to the passage, had fallen by lot to those of the Christians who were most careful in their observances, whom they call monks. These men, as chance would have it, were keeping some annual religious festival to God on that day. When night came on, they all felt great weariness on account of the festival, and, having sated themselves with food and drink beyond their wont, they fell into a sweet and gentle sleep, and were consequently quite unaware of what was going on. So the Persians made their way through the passage inside the fortifications, a few at a time, and, mounting the tower, they found the monks still sleeping and slew them to a man. When Kabades learned this, he brought his ladders up to the wall close by this tower. It was already day, and those of the townsmen who were keeping guard on the adjoining tower became aware of the disaster, and ran thither with all speed to give assistance. Then, for a long time, both sides struggled to crowd back the other, and already the townsmen were gaining the advantage, killing many of those who had mounted the wall and throwing back the men on the ladders, and they came very near to averting the danger. But Kabades drew his sword and, terrifying the Persians constantly with it, rushed in person to the ladders and would not let them draw back, and death was the punishment for those who dared turn to leave. As a result of this, the Persians, by their numbers, gained the upper hand and overcame their antagonists in the fight. So the city was captured by storm on the 80th day after the beginning of the siege. On January 11th, 503 AD, there followed a great massacre of the townspeople until one of the citizens, an old man and a priest, approached Kabades as he was riding into the city and said that it was not a kingly act to slaughter captives. Then Kabades, still moved with passion, replied, "But why did you decide to fight against me?" And the old man answered quickly, "Because God willed to give Amida into thy hand, not so much because of our decision as of thy valor." Kabades was pleased by this speech and permitted no further slaughter. Abi bade the Persians plunder the property and make slaves of the survivors, and he directed them to choose out for himself all the notables among them. A short time after this, he departed, leaving there to garrison a place 1,000 men under command of Glones, Persian, and some few unfortunates among the citizens of Amida who were destined to minister as servants to the daily wants of the Persians. He himself, with all the remainder of the army and the captives, marched away homeward. These captives were treated by Kabades with a generosity befitting a king, for after a short time he released all of them to return to their homes, but he pretended that they had escaped from him by stealth, and the Roman Emperor Anastasius also showed them honor worthy of their bravery, for he remitted to the city all the annual taxes for the space of 7 years, and presented all of them as a body, and each one of them separately with many good things, so that they came fully to forget the misfortunes which had befallen them. But this happened in later years. Chapter 47. How afterwards King Kabades was defeated by the Romans. The Emperor of Rome, Anastasius, who had been definitely proclaimed an acclaimed emperor by the whole of the Roman world, held sway over all the provinces of the Romans except the kingdom of the Goths, and over those eastern parts of the Persians, which latter lay between the rivers of the Tanais and the Phasis, together with Iberia. Also, the aforenamed King Kobad had taken possession of all the provinces which were outside the limits of these two kings, save only Lazica and Armenia, which latter province belonged to the Persians by treaty, but was occupied at that time by the king of the Goths. Of these matters we have already treated at length in the 4th book. And so, after the taking of Amida, the aforesaid kings continued at peace for 3 years. In the 4th year after this peace, King Kobad assembled his forces and marched against the Romans. Now, the Romans had built for their defense, along the confines of the Persians, a wall from the river Tanais to the mountains of Colchida. And when the Persians heard that the Romans were building this wall, they were grieved at heart, thinking that thereby their country would be shut off from the sea. And therefore, when King Kavadz set out on this campaign, his first thought was to destroy the wall. So it came about that while his lieutenants were raising a siege in Armenia, he himself descended into Mesopotamia, where he fought many battles with the Romans and utterly destroyed the wall. Though indeed some Romans repulsed him, but without doing much damage, and retired into the city of Dara. So he ravaged the district round about and returned into his own country. In the 6th year after this, in the month of January, he again raised a great host and marched with it into Mesopotamia. But in the beginning of his march, his men cut down a great forest in the plain of Eutropha, which is in Armenia, and made a rampart of the trunks of trees extending for the whole breadth of the plain and reaching up to the height of 4 cubits. This rampart was more than 3 miles long and so high that neither men nor cavalry could pass over it. For this reason, when the Romans came upon the camp and beheld this rampart, they despaired of being able to attack the Persians. Nevertheless, the general of the Romans, Belisarius, finding no other way out of the difficulty, led his troops across the river Cyrus and descended into the plain. And on the following day, he pitched his camp close beside the Persians, being separated from them only by the forest. For the Persians had not yet cleared away this obstacle. Then Belisarius opened negotiations with the Persians, saying that he wished to see King Clovis, and the Persians assented to this proposal. And so, when the Romans had removed the forest, Belisarius went into the Persian camp and was received with fitting honors. And when he had conferred with the king, he withdrew to his own camp, and the Persians also withdrew from the plain and pitched their camp upon the river. On the morrow, Belisarius again entered the Persian camp, and the king received him as before. But on that night, Belisarius gave orders to his soldiers to arm themselves secretly and come to him in the camp. And in the night, he crossed over to the Persians, attacked them, and killed many, including the king's brother. Thence, he withdrew to his own camp and the Persians to theirs. Then Belisarius again entered the Persian camp and asked for the king, and the Persians showed him where he was sitting, upon which he made as if to sit down. But really he sent to his own camp for some men who were lying in wait. And when these came and joined him, he rose up and ordered the Persians to rise also and follow him. Okay. And when they had left the tent, he gave command to his men to slay them all. Okay. And so he killed many of the Persians, though some escaped and fled. Then he returned to his own camp, having taken with him into captivity the wife of King Kabitz, her son, and the sister of the king, as well as many noble Persians. When King Kabitz learned this, he forthwith raised a great host and marched against Belisarius, who was encamped in the plain, and he sent to tell him that he should surrender and give up his prisoners, promising him safety in return. But Belisarius replied that the Persians had better arm themselves, for that he was coming to take them by force. Then the Persians marshaled their forces and prepared for battle. Okay? And at the same time, the Romans also prepared each man to his task. Okay? And so they fought for a long time, the issue of the battle being doubtful. At last, the Persians were getting the upper hand, but Belisarius rallied his men and renewed the fight. And when the Persians perceived that they were not able to prevail against the Romans, they retreated to their camp. But the Romans pursued them closely, and the Persians defended their camp with all their might. So they fought from the rampart. And the Romans made a breach in it, and some of them entered the camp, and immediately a great battle ensued within the camp. But the Persians were too strong for them and drove them out again. and thus they fought until evening, and then they separated for the night. On the morrow, the Romans were again victorious and pressed hard upon the Persians, and they made another breach in the rampart. Then the Romans rushed in a second time and slew the Persian king's brother and put him to flight. And when the Persians saw that their king's brother was fleeing, they abandoned the fight and fled also. When King Arcadius learned this, he fled with all his might into the mountains, and Belisarius pursued him as far as Ctesiphon, where he encamped. Then Belisarius turned back and ravaged all the plain and returned into his own camp. He sent to tell the king that he should come to him unarmed, promising him safety. But Arcadius replied that he should come to him as Belisarius had done to him, without weapons and unarmed. Then Belisarius crossed over to the Persians and went into their king's tent and sat down. And when Arcadius came in, he welcomed him honorably. And after they had discussed various matters, Belisarius took his leave and went into his own camp. Thus, the Romans remained in Persia for 8 years, and they ravaged the country round about. And when King Arcadius heard of this, he fled with all his might into the mountains, and Belisarius pursued him as far as Ctesiphon, where he encamped. Then Belisarius turned back and ravaged all the plain and returned into his own camp. He sent to tell the king that he should come to him unarmed, promising him safety. But Arcadius replied that he should come to him as Belisarius had done to him, without weapons and unarmed. Then Belisarius crossed over to the Persians and went into their king's tent and sat down. And when Arcadius came in, he welcomed him honorably. And after they had discussed various matters, Belisarius took his leave and went into his own camp. Thus, the Romans remained in Persia for 8 years, and they ravaged the country round about. That an opportunity for peace was lost. A letter meant to build alliance turned into an insult. A prince meant to be a bridge became a sword, and an army meant to hold the line almost collapsed, not from the enemy, but from within. Perozes would never forget this humiliation. His fury would not fade. It would shape the wars of the future. And Belisarius, the man who was mocked by his own soldiers, would rise again, because this was only the beginning of his legend. But let's start at the beginning. Imagine being a Roman soldier in the year 538 AD. Your general, Belisarius, has just scored a huge victory against the Goths. But now everyone is talking about a new threat, an empire in the east that calls itself Sasanian, but everyone calls it Persian. And this wasn't any small local power. We're talking about an empire with a standing army of 40,000 men, not to mention their allies, the Turks. It's intimidating, but your job is simple. Stand at this river called Callinicus and don't let them cross. Easy, right? Well, turns out Roman discipline wasn't what it used to be. Soldiers were getting drunk, gambling, and generally causing trouble. So when the Persians approached, there was a good reason to worry. Now, leading the Persians is a guy named Perozes, also known as Arcadius. He's a warrior, but he's also a diplomat. In fact, he opens with a letter to the Roman emperor, not an outright threat, but a warning. He basically says, hey, back off our land or else. The letter does the trick. The Romans retreat, but then something weird happens. Arcadius' troops cross anyway. They plundered nearby towns. It seems like a betrayal. But here's the thing. Arcadius got a plan. He sends another letter, this time to the real ruler of Rome, not the emperor, but the queen, Theodora. She's the one who made the decision to go to war with the Goths, and she's pretty hot-headed herself. So Arcadius' letter is like a Hail Mary, a desperate attempt to get her on his side. He basically says, look, I'm just doing what you told Belisarius to do. Now, let's be friends and split the Goths' lands. And it almost works. Queen Theodora is ready to make a deal, but Belisarius comes back from campaigning and throws a wrench in the plan. Key doesn't want to share the spoils, and, to be honest, Key doesn't like the idea of sharing his empire with a bunch of barbarians, even if they're Christian. Plus, he's got a personal score to settle with Arcadius, after what happened at Callinicus. So, the stage is set for war. In one corner, you have Belisarius, the legendary general who hasn't lost a battle yet. And in the other, you have Chosroes, the warrior king who might just turn out to be a better diplomat than general. The odds are stacked against him, but remember, this is just the beginning of his story, and now we wait. Will Chosroes use his diplomatic skills to outmaneuver the Romans, or will Belisarius' military genius prevail? You decide their fates by supporting the channel, okay? Every like and sub helps shape their destinies and ensures that their stories continue to be told. Don't forget, in this clash of titans, their fates hang in the balance, and their decisions will echo through the ages. This moment, this clash near Callinicus, was more than just a battle. It was the breaking point between two ancient worlds that could never trust each other. For the Persians, it was a chance to push back the Romans and secure their eastern borders. For the Romans, it was a test of their endurance, a fight to hold on to their hard-won peace. But most importantly, it was a moment of missed opportunities. A letter that could have been a pact turned into a battlefield. A victory that should have built trust became a reason for revenge. In the end, history reminds us, empires are not destroyed in a single war. They crack slowly through pride, politics, and the failure to listen. As we watch Belisarius and Chosroes prepare for their next moves, remember the words of the philosopher Thucydides. The secret of success in war is not merely in being strong, but in being too strong to be attacked. Will either of these titans heed his advice? You'll have to wait till next time to find out. Keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget the price of pride. See you next time.